The road north from the Rum River trading post was not a road that rewarded casual use in January. Oscar Makinen knew this. He had known it for 11 winters, the specific knowledge of a man who had learned the difference between a road that was difficult and a road that was trying to kill you. The 12 miles of packed earth and frozen mud that cut through the birch timber to the scattered homestead claims on the lake plain was in January the second kind. The kind where the cold came through the wool and the leather and found the places where a man was insufficiently prepared and settled there and waited. He had left the trading post at first light, not because he had intended to make the Voss claim his destination. He had intended to reach the Halverson claim at the north end of the lake plain, where Halverson had ordered a supply of lamp oil and 2 coils of rope that had been sitting in the trading post storeroom since December, waiting for a day when the road was passable enough to justify the journey. This was that day. Barely. The temperature at first light had been -32, which was not the worst the season had produced, and the wind had stopped sometime in the night, which made -32 survivable in a way that -22 with wind was not. He had not planned to stop at the Voss claim. He stopped because of the smoke. He saw it from the tree line, 200 yards out where the birch timber thinned and gave way to the open ground of the claim. The chimney of the Voss cabin was producing smoke. This was not surprising. What was surprising was the quality of the smoke. Oscar had spent 11 Minnesota winters reading chimney smoke, the way a sailor reads the surface of water from what it told you about what was happening underneath. Heavy, urgent smoke meant a fire being built up from near cold someone who had let the stove die in the night and was now throwing wood at it in the desperate arithmetic of a cabin that had lost its warmth and needed it back before the cold did permanent damage to the pipes or the people. Thin, intermittent smoke meant a fire being rationed, someone managing a dwindling wood supply with the careful mathematics of a person who had started to understand that February was further away than the woodpile. The smoke from the Voss chimney was neither of these things. It was thin, it was steady, it rose in a pale gray column that barely moved in the still air, climbing straight up into the white sky with the unhurried consistency of a fire that was doing its job and had been doing its job for some time, and expected to continue doing its job without drama. It was the smoke of a fire that was comfortable, the smoke of a system that was not being asked to compensate for anything. Oscar sat on his horse at the tree line and looked at that smoke for a long moment. He was a practical man. He had not survived 11 Minnesota winters by being anything other than practical. He was also in the specific way of a man who had spent those winters watching the frontier resolve itself into problems that required solutions, a careful observer. And what he was observing did not fit the shape of what he had expected to observe. Eleanor Voss was 62 years old. She had been alone on the claim since September when her husband August had gone south to St. Paul for the winter supply and had not returned. It was now January 15th. That was 4 months. 4 months alone on a claim built for 2 with a Minnesota winter that had started early and shown no interest in moderation. Oscar had passed the Voss claim 3 times since November, each time noting the chimney smoke, each time filing the observation under the category of things he would check on when the road permitted. The road had not permitted until today, and now the smoke was wrong. Not wrong in the way that meant disaster, wrong in the way that meant something he did not yet understand. He moved his horse out of the tree line and across the open ground of the claim, and then he saw the back wall of the cabin. He had helped raise that cabin in the summer of 1868, one of a dozen men who had spent 3 August days setting the logs and cutting the window frames and fitting the roof boards, while Eleanor Voss, who had been Eleanor Koskinen, then newly arrived from the Finnish province of Heim, had fed them all from a fire she built in the open yard with an efficiency that had impressed men who were themselves not easily impressed. He knew that cabin. He knew it had 2 windows and a door and 4 solid walls and no other openings. The back wall now had a hole in it, not a window, a hole roughly framed with boards approximately 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, set low in the wall near the ground. And from that hole running east toward the limestone outcrop at the edge of the claim, there extended a low structure. Poles and boards and bark and packed snow running 15 feet across the frozen ground toward the stone face, looking from a distance like something a large animal had built, or like something a very determined human being had constructed with the materials available and the time that the October weather had permitted before the hard cold arrived. Oscar looked at the hole and the structure for a moment. He said quietly in the Norwegian that was his language for things that required a language, "What has she done?" He rode to the cabin. He dismounted and tied his horse at the post and knocked on the door. Eleanor Voss opened it. She was wearing her work apron, the heavy canvas one she wore when the work required protection from things that stained or cut or abraded. Her hands were dusty with what looked like limestone powder. She looked at him with the specific expression of a woman who had been in the middle of a task when interrupted, and who was calculating whether the interruption was worth the disruption to her morning. She said, "Oscar, come in." He came in. The room was 68 degrees. She said, "Sit down. I will show you what I have done." He sat. He looked at the room the way you looked at a room that was telling you something unexpected. The room looked like the Voss cabin he remembered from the raising in 1868. The same shelf with the same dishes, the same table and the same two chairs, the same hook by the door where August's winter coat had hung for 7 years, and where it did not hang now because August was not here. The room had the specific quality of a space that had been used and maintained by one person for a long time. Not the neglect of a place abandoned to grief, but the careful order of a place being managed with the attention of someone who understood that order was not a luxury, but a requirement. What was different was the hole in the back wall and the temperature and the small door fitted into the hole, two rough planks hinged at the top and pinned shut with a wooden peg. He looked at the door and looked at the thermometer and looked at Eleanor Voss standing at the stove with limestone dust on her hands at -38 outside. He said 68 degrees. She said 69 this morning. It drops slightly in the afternoon when the outdoor cold is at its peak. She said it the way she said most things, with the flatness of a woman reporting measurements rather than experiences. He said, "Eleanor, what is through that door?" She said, "The cave passage." She paused. "I will show you after the coffee." She said, "First, let me tell you about September." He sat. He listened. She told him about September, the way her father had taught her to explain a problem, beginning with the facts and proceeding to the arithmetic and not skipping steps, because skipping steps was how you ended up with the wrong answer. August had left in the first week of September for the winter supply run to St. Paul. This was the established pattern, the same journey he had made in the fall of every year since they had filed on the claim in 1868. The journey south, the supply purchased the return before the hard weather. It had been reliable for 5 years. But Eleanor had known since August of the previous summer that this year was different. She paused here. She set her coffee cup down and looked at it for a moment. She said, "August has a debt. He has had it since 1871. I have known about it since last August when I found the paper in his coat pocket. A debt to a man in St. Paul. Not a large debt in the way that debts are measured in St. Paul. A very large debt in the way that debts are measured on a homestead claim in Minnesota." She said this without dramatics. She said it the way she said everything as information. Oscar said nothing. He had known August Voss for 7 years. He had not known about a debt. Eleanor said August went to St. Paul to get the supply and to try to settle the debt. "I do not know exactly how. I know he has not come back, and I know it is January, and I know that what matters now is not the debt, but the winter." She said, "I decided in September that I would stay." She said it simply, as if the decision had not been the kind of decision that broke people, as if it were a mathematical conclusion rather than an act of will. Oscar said alone, "She said, I know this claim. I know this soil and this water and this timber. I have known them for 6 years." She paused. "I do not know St. Paul. I do not know how to be a woman alone in a town." She said, "The claim is what I know how to manage." She stood and went to the shelf and brought back a notebook. The cover was worn and the pages were thick with writing. She opened it to the first pages dated September 1873 and set it in front of him. The September pages were arithmetic. Not the rough arithmetic of guesswork, but the careful arithmetic of a woman who had learned to think in systems before she learned to think in anything else. 7 cord of wood, 1 person. A cabin with a surface area she had measured and recorded in square feet. An outdoor temperature range she had estimated from the previous 5 winters. A stove with a known output. The calculation was clear, and the conclusion was clear. 7 core was enough for a single person to maintain the same room temperature as 2 people had maintained the previous year, because the stove's job was determined by the cabin's heat loss, and the cabin's heat loss was determined by the temperature difference between inside and outside and the quality of the walls, and those numbers did not change because there was one person instead of two. But the but was February. February was not an arithmetic problem. February was a physics problem. A week at -45 in February would run through wood at a rate that even 7 cord could not sustain without a strategy she did not yet have. She had written this in the notebook. She had underlined it. She had written beneath the underline in her careful hand, "Find the strategy." Oscar read the September pages. He turned them slowly. He was a man who had spent his working life in the trading post dealing in the arithmetic of supply and demand, and he recognized the quality of this arithmetic. It was not the arithmetic of a frightened woman making calculations to reassure herself. It was the arithmetic of someone identifying a gap and beginning to look for the materials to bridge it. He said, "You wrote this in September." She said the first week of September, before August left. He looked up at her. She said, "I have been thinking about this winter since last August, when I found the paper in his coat." She had known for a year. She had been preparing for a year. August had walked out of the yard in September with the wagon and the horses, and Eleanor Voss had watched him go and then turned back to the cabin and opened the notebook she had already started. Oscar sat with this for a moment. Then she told him about October 3rd. She had been cutting birch poles in the east timber, the thin, straight poles she needed for the fence repair she had been putting off since summer. The work required crouching, cutting low on the trunk where the wood was straightest. And because she was crouched, and because she was at the east edge of the claim, near the limestone outcrop that ran along the property line, and because she was crouched lower than she would normally have crouched when walking past that outcrop, she saw something she had not seen in 6 years of walking past that limestone face. A darkness behind the overhang. Not the shallow darkness of a surface recess, a deeper darkness. The kind of darkness that meant space. She had gone back to the cabin for the torch and the thermometer. She said this matter-of-factly as if going back for instruments before investigating an unknown space was the obvious response, which for Eleanor Voss it was. The entrance passage was 8 feet of low crawlway, 3 feet high, 4 feet wide, cutting back through the limestone under the overhang. At the end of the passage, the cave opened. A chamber 8 feet high, 12 feet across the walls, the smooth gray limestone of the Minnesota bedrock, the ceiling following the natural arch of the rock strata, the floor covered in a thin layer of mineral silt. She had stood in the chamber with the torch and taken the temperature. 51 degrees. She said the number quietly, the way you said a number that had changed everything. 51 degrees in a cave with no fire and no sun and no body heat on a morning when the outdoor temperature was 41 degrees. 10 degrees warmer than the outside air. In October, with nothing to explain it except the rock itself. She had stood in the cave with the thermometer and understood in the specific way of a woman who had spent the previous month thinking about thermal problems exactly what she was looking at. Her father had been a charcoal burner in the forest of Heim for 30 years, a man who spent his working life managing the thermal properties of large masses of material, who understood before the word was available to him what thermal mass meant in practice. He had taught her the behavior of heat in large objects. How a charcoal pile 3 days after the fire inside it had gone out was still warm at the center. How the mass held the heat of the burn long after the surface had cooled. How the inside of the pile remembered last week's fire while the outside responded to today's cold. The cave was not a charcoal pile, but the principle was the same. The limestone of the Minnesota Lake Plain, the bedrock that underlay the valley at depths of 15 to 20 feet, had been absorbing the heat of the Minnesota summer since June. 4 months of warmth conducted slowly into the rock by the patient physics of thermal diffusion. And now in October, when the surface air had already cooled to 41 degrees, the rock at depth was still holding the heat of July. It would hold it slowly. It would release it slowly. It would decline not at the rate of air which changed temperature with every shift of wind and cloud, but at the rate of limestone which changed temperature at the rate of something that had been accumulating heat for 4 months and would take the entire winter to release it. She had known this the way her father had taught her to know it, not as a formula, but as a behavior. And she had known standing in the cave entrance with the thermometer reading 51 degrees what it meant. She walked back to the cabin and measured the distance from the back wall to the cave entrance. 15 feet. She stood at the cave entrance and looked at the cabin back wall and understood that 15 feet of connection would change everything she had calculated about the winter. If the cabin opened to a passage and the passage connected to the cave, the air entering the cabin would come through the cave. It would enter the cave at outdoor temperature. It would travel through 8 feet of limestone passage and 12 feet of limestone chamber in contact with walls that were 51 degrees. It would arrive at the cabin not at minus 38, but at something approaching the cave temperature. The stove would receive pre-warmed air. The stove's job would not be to raise the temperature from minus 38 to 68. Its job would be to raise the temperature from 50 to 68. The difference was not arithmetic. The difference was physics. She went back to the cabin and opened the notebook and did the calculation. Without the cave in January at minus 38, the stove was performing 106 degrees of work. That was the gap between minus 38 outside and 68 inside, adjusted for the cabin's infiltration rate. With the cave pre-warming the incoming air to 50 degrees, the stove was performing 18 degrees of work. The ratio was 1 to 6. 1 cord of wood with the cave connection would do the work of 6 cord without it. She had 7 cord. 7 cord at the efficiency of 6 to 1 was the effective equivalent of 42 cord. She was not going to run out of wood. She had written that line in the notebook and underlined it twice. Then she had looked at it for a long time, the way you looked at a number that was almost too large to trust. Then she had started drawing the plans for the passage. Oscar read all of this in the notebook. He read it slowly, turning the pages with the care of a man handling something that was more important than it appeared. The September arithmetic and the October calculations, and the thermal reasoning that connected them. The passage dimensions, the door construction, the projected temperature curve for the cave from October through April. She had projected the cave temperature decline at 2 degrees per month based on the thermal inertia of the rock mass she had estimated at 300 tons minimum. She had projected the cave reaching 45 degrees in April, which was the mean annual ground temperature for the Minnesota Valley. She had written the cave will not go below 45 degrees. The rock mass is too great for a single winter to penetrate to the core. And then the line she had written beneath all the calculations in Finnish, in the smaller handwriting she used for the things that were not calculations, Kallio muistaa kesän. The rock remembers summer. Oscar did not speak Finnish, but Eleanor translated it for him because it was the sentence her father had said about the charcoal pile, and because it was the sentence that had told her standing in the cave entrance with the thermometer in her hand that she understood what she had found. She said my father said it when he wanted to explain why the pile stayed warm after the fire was gone. The pile remembered the fire the way the rock remembers the summer. Too much mass to forget quickly. Oscar closed the notebook. He looked at Eleanor Voss across the table. She was 62 years old, Finnish by birth, and American by a crossing she had made at 40, in a ship she had described once to him briefly as adequate. She had spent 20 years in the new country, learning its winters and its soil, and its specific indifference to human plans, and she had responded to that indifference in the way she responded to everything by taking measurements and doing arithmetic and building what the arithmetic said to build. He said, "Show me." She showed him. She stood and went to the small door in the back wall. She unhooked the wooden peg and pulled the door inward on its top hinge. Behind it was the passage she had built in October, 4 feet wide and 4 feet tall and 15 feet long, the birch pole frame and the board roof and the bark cover and the packed snow insulation visible in the dim light of the January afternoon. She took the torch from the wall bracket and crouched and went through. Oscar followed. The passage was warmer than the January air outside, had any right to produce the temperature rising as he moved through the low tunnel, the cold of the outdoor January, retreating behind the insulation of bark and snow and the thermal buffer of the rock ahead. He could feel it on his face with each foot of progress, a gradual softening of the air, as though the passage itself was performing work on the cold and finding it wanting. At the end of the passage, he stood up in the cave chamber. He looked at the thermometer Eleanor had mounted on the cave wall at eye height, 49 degrees. He reached out and placed his hand against the limestone wall. The stone was warm, not fire warm, not body warm. the specific warmth of something that had been absorbing heat for a very long time and was releasing it at the rate of something that was too large to hurry. The warmth of mass, the warmth that Eleanor's father had known in the charcoal pile. The warmth that had nothing to do with today's weather or last night's cold, or the minus 38 degrees that was currently waiting outside the limestone walls for something it was not going to get. He held his hand against the rock and felt the temperature of a July that had ended 4 months ago, stored in stone, that had been accumulating summers since before anyone in Minnesota had been alive to name them. Oscar stood in the 49-degree cave in January in Minnesota and said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to Eleanor, who was standing at the back of the chamber with a torch watching him with the patient expression of a woman who had already worked through everything he was currently working through several months ago, and who was simply waiting for him to arrive at the conclusions she had already reached. He said, "You calculated this in September." She said the arithmetic was September. The cave was October. The passage was 3 weeks in October. By November, it was simply the winter. He sat in the wood. She took the notebook from the pocket of her apron. She opened it to the current page. She read him the numbers. 1 cord and 3/4 consumed since November 1st. Current wood remaining 5 cord and 1/4. Projected total winter consumption 4 cord. 4 cord from 7. The stove running at 1/6 of the load it would carry without the cave connection, the difference paid by 400 tons of limestone that had spent the summer charging itself with July heat and was now spending the winter returning it degree by degree at the unhurried rate of rock that had been doing this since long before anyone in Minnesota had been alive to notice. She said by March the cave will be 45 degrees. It will not go below 45. The mean annual temperature of this valley is 45 degrees, and the rock mass extends too deep for a single winter to cool it further. She paused. She said the stove takes the air from cave temperature to 68. At minus 38 outside today, the cave is doing 83 degrees of pre-warming before the air enters the passage. The stove handles the remaining 18 degrees. The colder it gets outside, the larger the advantage. Oscar repeated this to himself. He turned it over in the specific way of a practical man encountering something that violated his working model of what was possible. He said the worse the winter is, the more the cave helps. She said yes. He looked at the cave walls, at the smooth curved limestone ceiling that the water had been carving for geological time, at the thermometer reading 49 in a Minnesota January, at the torch flame burning steadily in the still air of the chamber, the warmth of the rock keeping the air at a temperature that the outdoor January had no access to. He said, "Cornelius Thwaite said you were living in a cave." She said, "I live in the cabin." She said it with the specific patience of a woman who was not angry about the wrong opinion, but who wanted the record to be accurate. She said the cave is the thermal buffer. It is not living quarters. I sleep at 68 degrees in the cabin. I come into the cave for maintenance and temperature readings. She said the cave is 49 degrees. Nobody lives at 49 degrees by choice. He said I should have come sooner. She said you came when the road allowed. She said it without accusation because she did not traffic in accusation. They stood in the cave for another minute. The torch burned steadily. Outside, the January cold continued its patient work against the world, and inside the limestone chamber, the temperature was 49 degrees and had been 49 degrees all morning, and would be 49 degrees when the sun went down, because the rock did not care what the air above it was doing. The rock was too large and too old to care about a single winter. He said Cornelius should see this. She said, "Bring him Saturday." She paused. "And bring the Pelhams." He looked at her. She said, "Edna Pelham's hands were shaking when I saw her at the trading post in October. She is 61 years old, and she is on the South Lake claim with Rutherford, and they have a cord of wood, perhaps less by now, and they are burning green timber from the tree line because the season's supply ran short in December." She said the South Lake claims have limestone outcrops. "I know of 3. If any of them have cavities behind the face, the construction takes 10 days with 4 people, and I can teach the construction." She said the concept is the only part that is not obvious. Once the concept is understood, the building is boards and bark and clay and a door that breathes. Oscar looked at her. He said a door that breathes. She said it must allow airflow or the system does not work. The cave must breathe. It cannot breathe too fast. She said, "I will show you the door before you go." She showed him. The cave entrance door, built from 2 layers of birch bark, with a 3-inch air gap between the layers mounted on a pole hinge at the top of the entrance frame. She held the torch to the gap at the bottom of the door, where it met the stone floor. The flame bent inward. She said the warm cave air creates a slight negative pressure as it rises. It pulls outdoor air slowly into the chamber, through the passage into the cabin. At every stage, the rock moderates the incoming air. She said if you seal the cave entrance completely, the convection stops and the pre-warming stops and the system dies. If you leave it too open, wind drives cold air into the cave faster than the rock can moderate it. She said the door must breathe. It just cannot breathe too fast. He said, and you determine the correct construction how. She said by holding a burning twig at the gap and watching the direction of the smoke. If the smoke goes inward, the system is breathing correctly. She said it took 2 attempts in October to get the door right. The second version has been breathing correctly since October 25th. She handed him the notebook. She said, give this to Cornelius Thwaite before Saturday. Let him read the temperature log himself. Tell him to start at the September pages and read in order. He is a reasonable man, and the temperature log is not an opinion. Oscar took the notebook. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of 3 months of daily readings, 3 columns every morning, the record of a system that had been built on arithmetic worked out alone in September, and that had been confirmed by every morning since. He crawled back through the passage to the cabin. She followed. She closed the passage door and pinned it. The cabin was 68 degrees. He put on his coat. He was a practical man from the Norwegian province of Vestfold who understood that coats were for the outside and that the outside was where he was going. She said, Saturday? He said, Saturday. She said, tell him to read the numbers. Tell him to start with September and not skip ahead. He opened the door. The cold came in the way it always came in, immediately and completely, the -38 air filling the doorway without hesitation or manners. He stepped out into it and the door closed behind him. He stood in the yard before going to his horse, looking at the low structure connecting the cabin's back wall to the limestone outcrop, the bark and board, and packed snow that had looked from the road like something between a tunnel and an animal burrow. And that was, he now understood, the most carefully reasoned piece of construction he had encountered in 11 winters on the Minnesota frontier. 15 feet of passage through which the winter's worst cold arrived at the stove, already moderated by 400 tons of rock. The rock that remembered July. Oscar Makinen untied his horse and mounted and turned south toward the trading post. He had lamp oil to deliver to Halverson. He had a notebook to deliver to Cornelius Thwaite. And he had, for the first time in 4 months of passing the Voss claim and noting the chimney smoke, of an understanding of what the smoke had been telling him all along. It was the smoke of a system working exactly as designed. Saturday came in at -41. Oscar Makinen had been watching the thermometer outside the trading post since before dawn, the way a man watches something he hopes will change, and that does not change. At 4 in the morning, it had read -38. At 6, it had dropped to -40. By the time the sky had lightened enough to call it morning, it was -41, and holding the air so cold it had stopped behaving like air, and had started behaving like a substance, something with weight and intention and no interest in negotiation. He had considered sending word to postpone. He had not sent it. He had not sent it because of Edna Pelham's hands. He had stopped at the Pelham claim on Thursday, 2 days after leaving the Voss cabin, to deliver Eleanor's message and to see for himself what the situation was. Rutherford Pelham had opened the door and the room behind him had been 49 degrees, the same temperature as Eleanor's cave, except Eleanor's cave was a buffer between the winter and the cabin. The Pelham cabin was simply cold, the 49 degrees of a room that had been losing the argument against January for weeks, the fire in the stove burning green birch that hissed and smoked and produced a fraction of the heat of seasoned wood. Edna Pelham had been sitting at the table with her coat on. Her hands had been folded in her lap, and they had been shaking with the fine constant tremor of a body that had been cold for long enough that cold had become its default condition. She was 61 years old. She had crossed from Pennsylvania to Minnesota with Rutherford in 1866, and she had survived 6 Minnesota winters on the South Lake claim, and she was sitting in her own kitchen in her winter coat in a room that was 49 degrees because the wood supply had run short in December, and the green timber from the tree line burned wet and sullen and gave back maybe half of what seasoned wood would have given. Oscar had looked at Edna Pelham's shaking hands and had ridden back to the trading post and had written the note to Cornelius Thwaite that night by lamplight. Saturday, Voss claim, come prepared to crawl. So they rode out at first light into the -41 morning, 3 of them on the north road, through the birch timber. Scar in front, Cornelius Thwaite beside him, silent and upright in the saddle the way he was always silent and upright, the posture of a man who had spent 4 years in the Union Army and had never entirely stopped standing at attention even when sitting down. And behind them, Rutherford and Edna Pelham. Edna wrapped in every layer she owned, her face reduced to a narrow opening between wool and fur, through which her eyes moved steadily over the white landscape of the lake plain. Cornelius had read the notebook. Oscar knew this because Cornelius had said when he arrived at the trading post Thursday morning to collect it almost nothing. He had taken the notebook from the counter, opened it to the first page, read it, standing at the counter for 6 minutes without moving, then closed it and put it in his coat. He had asked one question before leaving: what page are the September calculations on? Oscar had told him. Cornelius had nodded and walked out. That was a man who had found something that required private consideration. Cornelius Thwaite expressed strong reactions by becoming very quiet and thorough. Oscar had ridden beside him through 11 miles of frozen birch timber this morning, and Cornelius had spoken perhaps 4 sentences, all of them practical, none of them about Eleanor Voss or the cave or the notebook. He was building something in his mind, and he was not ready to show the construction. They reached the Voss claim at 8:30. The chimney above the cabin sent its thin line of smoke into the still air, the same unhurried signal it had been sending since November. Eleanor Voss opened the door before they knocked. She had been watching from the window. She was wearing the work apron, and her hands were clean this morning. The limestone dust washed off because she had expected company, and she was a woman who made appropriate distinctions. The room behind her was 68 degrees. Oscar could feel it from the doorway, the warmth reaching out into the cold morning like a physical presence. Edna Pelham stepped through the door and stopped. She stood just inside the threshold and did not move for a moment. She was still wearing her coat and her scarf and her heavy mittens, and she stood in the 68-degree room, and something happened in her face that was not quite any single expression, but was the specific response of a body receiving something it had been denied for long enough that receiving it again was almost painful. She said nothing. Eleanor looked at her. Eleanor said nothing either. She simply took Edna's coat when Edna began to remove it and hung it on the hook by the door and gestured toward the chair nearest the stove. Edna sat down. She put her bare hands flat on the surface of the table. The table was warm, the warmth of a room that had been 68 degrees long enough that the wood had absorbed it. She looked at her hands on the warm wood and was very still. Not performing stillness. Simply still the way a person was still when the body was doing something important and had asked everything else to wait. The men came in behind her, Rutherford removing his hat, and last Cornelius Thwaite, who stepped through the door and stood in the room and looked at the thermometer on the east wall with the focused attention of a man verifying a fact he had already considered from multiple angles. He said 68 degrees. Eleanor said 67 this morning. It has come up in the last hour. Cornelius looked at her. He was 67 years old, white-haired, the specific physical type of a man who had been large in his 40s and had not entirely lost the architecture of it, even as the decades had worked on him. He had been postmaster at the Rum River Trading Post since 1861, which meant he had been the institutional memory of the settlement for 13 years, the man who knew where everyone's claim was and what their supply situation was, and who had said what to whom in November and what the consequences were in January. He was not a man who was wrong often. When he was wrong with complete conviction, which made the wrongness thorough and its correction significant. He said, "I read your notebook, Mrs. Voss." She said, "I know. Oscar told me." He said, "All of it." She said, "I expected you would." He said, "The September calculations." He paused with the pause of a man assembling something carefully before presenting it. "You wrote those before you found the cave." She said 3 weeks before. He said, "You knew what you needed before you found what you needed." She said, "I knew the shape of the solution. I did not know the specific form it would take." She said the cave was a specific form I had not anticipated. When I found it, I recognized that it fit the shape I had been looking for. Cornelius absorbed this. Then he said, I told people you were living in a cave. She said, I know. He said, I said it as a conclusion, not a question. She said you were working from what you could observe from the road, the hole in the wall and the structure going toward the rock. She said it without edge. She said it was a reasonable inference from the outside. You did not have the arithmetic. He said no. He said it simply the way a man said something when he had decided to say it cleanly and without decoration. No, I did not have the arithmetic. There was a pause in which the stove did its quiet work and the thermometer held at 68, and the January cold pressed against the walls from outside without getting anywhere. Eleanor said, I will show you the passage in the cave. Then I would like to talk about the Drover's Ridge outcrop on the South Lake Plain. She looked at Rutherford and Edna. She said, I think what you see in the cave will make the conversation about the outcrop easier to have. She took the torch from the bracket. She unhooked the peg from the passage door. She crouched and went through. One by one they followed her. Oscar first because he had done it before and knew what to expect. Then Rutherford, who was a large man, and moved through the low passage with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating a space not designed for his dimensions. Then Cornelius upright until the passage forced him not to be moving through the low tunnel with a dignity that was only slightly compromised by the physical requirement. And last, Edna Pelham. Edna had not spoken since she sat down at the table. She had drunk the coffee Eleanor had poured for her, and she had held the cup in both hands, and she had sat in the 68-degree room with the stillness of a woman in the private process of becoming warm again, and it had been the most eloquent silence in the room. When Eleanor gestured toward the passage door, Edna stood and came without hesitation. She crawled through the passage and stood up in the cave chamber. She looked at the thermometer on the wall. 49 degrees. She looked at the walls. She reached out and put her hand flat against the limestone. She held it there. She said quietly to no one in particular, it's warm. She said it the way a person said something they already knew was true, but needed to say aloud to confirm it in the body rather than just the mind. Eleanor said 49 degrees. It has dropped 2 degrees since October. It will drop to 45 by April and hold there. The rock mass is too large for the winter to push it below the mean annual temperature of the valley. Rutherford said 45 degrees. In February. Eleanor said in February. In March. The colder the outdoor temperature, the greater the advantage the cave provides. This morning at -41 outside the cave is doing 90 degrees of pre-warming before the air enters the passage toward the cabin. The stove receives air already at cave temperature and raises it the remaining distance to 68. She said the stove is working 18 degrees of differential this morning. Without the cave, it would be working 109. The number settled into the cave air. Cornelius stood at the far wall of the chamber. He was not pressing his hand to the rock the way Oscar had done. He was looking at it with the evaluating attention of a man who had spent his professional life assessing claims and supplies and the credibility of what people told him. He was treating the limestone wall as evidence, which it was. He said, how much rock is this? Eleanor said, I have estimated 300 tons as a conservative figure based on the visible dimensions of the chamber and the standard density of Minnesota limestone. The chamber extends further back than I have fully explored. The actual mass is likely higher. He said 300 tons at 50 degrees. She said 49 now, declining at 2 degrees per month as projected. Cornelius turned from the wall and looked at her directly. He said, you calculated this in September, built it in October, and it has been running without failure since November. He said it not as a question, but as a statement he was making in order to hear it in his own voice. She said yes. He reached into the interior pocket of his coat. He produced the notebook she had given Oscar on Monday. He had read it at the trading post counter on Thursday. He had carried it since then, which was not something he had been asked to do. He held it out to her. He said, page 11, third column, last line. She took the notebook. She found the page. She read the cave connection reduces the stove's thermal load by approximately 83% at the January minimum temperature. 1 cord of wood performs the work of 6. She looked up. He said, I have been telling people since November that you were not thinking clearly. He did not soften this. He said, I was working from what I could see from the road and from 22 years of watching the frontier resolve people who made decisions that were worse than their problems. He said, in my experience, that is usually what a hole in the back wall of a cabin means. He paused. He said I was wrong. 3 words delivered with the same directness he brought to everything, no additional language around them to adjust their weight or soften their arrival. Cornelius Thwaite was a man who had been right often enough and long enough that being wrong was not something he had much practice with. The practice showed, but he was also a man for whom honesty was not optional, and what the evidence in his hands had shown him over the past 48 hours was not something he could carry without acknowledging. Eleanor said you made a reasonable assessment from incomplete information. She said the information that was missing was the arithmetic. She said most people who saw the hole in my wall and the structure going toward the rock would reach the same conclusion you reached. She said I do not fault you for the conclusion. I fault only the certainty with which you delivered it. He looked at her for a moment. He said that is a fair correction. The word had the quality of an account being settled. Not warmly, not with relief, but accurately, the way Cornelius Thwaite preferred to settle accounts. Rutherford Pelham had been standing quietly to one side, and now he spoke. He said, I have perhaps 3/4 of a cord remaining. We have been burning green birch from the east timber line since the 22nd of December. He said it with the steady voice of a man reporting a measurement, but underneath the steadiness, there was the particular weight of a man who had failed at something he considered his essential responsibility. The provision of warmth for his wife. He said the cabin is holding 47 degrees on the worst days. He stopped there. Edna was still standing at the wall with her hand against the limestone. She did not look at her husband when he spoke. She looked at her hand on the warm rock, but everyone in the cave understood what her not looking contained. Eleanor said, tell me about the Drover's Ridge outcrop. She opened the notebook to a fresh page and picked up her pencil. Rutherford said it runs along our east property line. A low face, maybe 4 feet of exposed stone. It looks south and slightly west. Eleanor wrote this. She said, is the base undercut? Is there an overhang where the top of the face extends further out than the bottom? Rutherford thought for a moment. He said, yes. There is an overhang. The top of the face comes out further than the base by a foot, maybe more. Eleanor wrote, south-facing undercut face. Probable dissolution cavity. She said the south-facing aspect is favorable. A face that looks south receives more direct sunlight during the summer months than a face looking any other direction. More solar input over June, July, and August means more heat conducted into the rock behind the face. More accumulated heat means a warmer cavity and a greater thermal advantage when the winter arrives. She said the undercutting indicates water has been working at the base of the face, the same frost and dissolution process that created this chamber. She said it is not certain that there is a cavity behind the Drover's Ridge face, but the conditions that produce cavities are present. She said it is worth going to look before deciding the cavity is not there. Looking costs an afternoon. Assuming no cavity when there is one costs the winter. Cornelius said, how do you look? She said, you go to the face and you crouch at the base and you look under the overhang. She said, you take a torch and if there is a cavity of any depth, the torch will show you more than the eye expects. She said you take the thermometer, and if the cavity is more than a few feet deep, the thermometer will tell you whether the rock has been accumulating heat. She said if the temperature inside the cavity is higher than the outdoor air temperature, you have something worth building for. Cornelius said, and if the cavity is there and the temperature is right, she said the construction takes 10 days with 4 people who know what they are building. I can teach the method as we build. She said the Pelhams could have a functioning system before February. The word February moved through the cave quietly. Everyone present understood what February meant on the South Lake Plain for a family with 3/4 of a cord of wood and a stove burning green timber. Cornelius said, how certain are you there is a cavity at Drover's Ridge? She said, certain enough to look before deciding there isn't one. She said I would not frame the Pelham cabin wall before confirming the cavity exists, but I would not write off the possibility before spending an afternoon at the face. She said probability is not certainty, but it is a reason to investigate. She said the Minnesota Lake Plain sits on a continuous limestone formation. The dissolution process that created this cave has been running for the same duration under the entire valley. She said the caves are probably there. The question is whether anyone has looked. Oscar said most people have not needed to look. She said yes. She said when the frontier arithmetic works as expected, most people do not need to look. She said when it stops working, you look for what you did not know was there. She paused. She looked at Edna Pelham, who was still standing at the cave wall, with her hand against the limestone. She said, I am 62 years old and I have been alone on this claim since September. I did not have the option of waiting for the arithmetic to improve on its own. She said it without self-pity and without pride. She said it as a statement of the conditions that had produced the solution. They went back through the passage to the cabin. Eleanor made more coffee and they sat at the table, 5 people in a 68-degree room at minus 41 outside, and Eleanor opened the notebook to the temperature log and walked them through it. 3 columns every morning since October 1st, outdoor temperature, cave temperature, cabin temperature. The outdoor temperatures ranged from positive 12 in a warm spell in late October to minus 41 this morning, a range of 53 degrees over 3.5 months. The cave temperatures ranged from 51 in October to 49 today, a range of 2 degrees over 3.5 months. The cabin temperatures range from 61 to 69, the variation corresponding to the outdoor swings, but significantly dampened the cave's buffering effect, reducing what the stove was required to compensate for. Cornelius studied the log with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered. He turned pages without speaking. His eyes moved down the columns in the way of someone checking arithmetic rather than reading narrative verifying the pattern against the claimed mechanism. He turned to the September calculation pages. He read them again here in the cabin, having already read them at the trading post on Thursday, and the second reading had the quality of a man checking his understanding of a proof. He found the same result both times. He said, you wrote the projection, and the projection has been accurate to within 1 degree per month for 3 months. She said the rock behaves as predicted. The thermal inertia of the mass is consistent with my father's observations of the charcoal pile scaled for the difference in material and volume. He set the notebook on the table. He said not to anyone in particular, as a man says something he needs to complete. In order to move past it, I told people in November she was not thinking clearly. He said I was the one not thinking clearly. He said I was thinking about what holes in cabin walls usually mean, and I was not thinking about what this particular woman with this particular background might have understood that I did not. The table was quiet. Eleanor said, Cornelius. He looked at her. She said, you are a reasonable man who made a reasonable assessment from what you could observe. She said, the correction is noted and accepted. She said, now I would like to talk about Monday morning and the Drover's Ridge outcrop, because Edna Pelham needs heat before February, and I believe it is there. Cornelius looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face settled the way a face settled when it had finished with one thing and was ready to begin another. He said, Monday. What time? She said, first light at the Pelham claim. She said, bring the framing chisel if you have one. He said, I have one. She said, good. She said, and bring a torch and a thermometer if you have them. She said the thermometer is how you know before you commit to 3 weeks of construction whether the cavity is what you need it to be. She said, you hold it in the cavity for 3 minutes and the number tells you whether the rock has been doing what the rock in this valley does. Rutherford said, and if the number is right, she said, then we begin the following morning. She said the concept is the only difficult part. The concept is that the cave is not the destination. It is the preparation. It changes what the stove is asked to do, and when you change what the stove is asked to do, you change how long the wood supply lasts, and when you change how long the wood supply lasts, you change what February means. She said the building after that is poles and boards and bark and clay and a door that is permeable but not open. She said I built this one alone in 3 weeks. With 4 people, it takes 10 days. She paused. She looked at Edna Pelham. Edna was looking back at her. She had been mostly quiet since entering the cabin, doing what she had been doing since they arrived, which was absorbing the 68 degrees with her whole body and observing Eleanor Voss with the particular attention of a woman who recognizes something in another woman that she wants to understand more precisely. Edna said, how do you maintain it? Once it is built, Eleanor said 10 minutes every Sunday. She said you walk the passage with your bare hand against every joint, feeling for cold air movement. When you find a gap, you fill it with the clay and moss mixture before it becomes a larger gap. She said small gaps become large gaps if you do not address them. Large gaps compromise the insulation and the connection fails. She said the system is only as strong as its weakest joint, but weak joints are findable if you look for them on a regular schedule and fillable if you find them while they are still small. Edna said you do this every Sunday. Eleanor said every Sunday since November 1st. She said, I have found 14 gaps in 3 months. None of them were catastrophic because I found them while they were small. Edna said 14 gaps. Eleanor said the wood settles. The temperature cycles cause expansion and contraction. Gaps are the natural consequence of a structure made from natural materials in a changing environment. She said expecting no gaps is expecting the structure to behave like something it is not. The maintenance is the system. Without the maintenance, the system degrades. Edna absorbed this. She nodded once with the nod of a woman who has just been given information she was already half prepared to receive. Cornelia stood and went to the window and looked out at the claim. At the limestone outcrop at the east edge visible from here as a low gray line above the snow. At the structure connecting the cabin to the cave covered in its layer of bark and packed snow. He looked at it with different eyes than he had looked at it with in November, when the hole in the wall and the structure toward the rock had seemed to him to be the evidence of a mind under pressure, making a decision worse than the problem it meant to solve. He looked at it now as what it was. He said quietly, not announcing the statement, but completing it, she is not living in a cave. He was correcting the record. It was the correction of a man who kept records and who understood that a wrong entry in the record was worse than an absent entry because a wrong entry misled everyone who consulted it afterward. Eleanor heard him. She said nothing in response because nothing in response was required. She closed the notebook and set it on the table. She said Monday morning, Drover's Ridge, first light. She said we will know within an hour whether the cavity is there. She said if it is there, we will know within another hour whether it has the temperature we need. She said if the temperature is what I expect, we can begin the frame that same afternoon. She said I want Edna Pelham to be warm before February. She said it directly and without embellishment the way she said everything that mattered most. As a fact, she intended to make true. Outside, the January cold continued its patient application against the walls of the Voss cabin and found nothing to work with. The stove burned its comfortable fire. The thermometer on the east wall held at 68 degrees. In the cave behind the back wall, the limestone held 49 degrees against a winter that had not managed to reach it yet and would not manage to reach it before the spring came and ended the contest. The rock remembered summer. It would keep remembering until there was a new summer to remember. Monday came in clear. The temperature had lifted 4 degrees overnight, which in the arithmetic of a Minnesota January meant nothing in terms of comfort and everything in terms of what was possible on the road. Minus 37 was not warm. But minus 37 without wind on a clear morning with the birch timber standing white and still on either side of the North Road was the kind of cold that a man or a woman of 60 could manage if they were dressed correctly and moving with purpose. They rode out from the Pelham claim at first light, 4 of them. Oscar and Cornelius and Eleanor on horseback, Rutherford Pelham on foot because the Pelham horses had been sold in November when the arithmetic of the winter had first begun to resolve against them, and Rutherford had made the calculation that horses required feed he could not provide, and that the claim could survive without them in ways that it could not survive without wood. Eleanor had not commented on this when Rutherford told her. She had simply adjusted the plan so that Rutherford walked the half-mile to the Drover's Ridge outcrop, with the rest of them riding beside him at the pace a 63-year-old man set on a frozen road at minus 37. She had brought the thermometer, she had brought the notebook, she had brought the torch wrapped in oilcloth against the cold, and the framing chisel, and the small iron bars she used for testing the solidity of stone before trusting her weight to it. Cornelius had watched her load these things into the saddlebag at the Pelham claim and had said nothing. He was learning over the course of these days that Eleanor Voss prepared for the thing she was going to do before she went to do it, and that watching her prepare told you more about what was coming than anything she said in advance. The Drover's Ridge outcrop was on the east boundary of the Pelham claim, running along the property line for 60 feet in the low-gray exposure of the Minnesota bedrock, the same formation that underlay the entire lake plain, expressing itself at the surface here, where the glacial drift was thin and the limestone had worked its way up through the overburden over geological time. Eleanor dismounted 20 feet from the face. She stood and looked at it the way she had learned to look at limestone faces in October, not for what was visible on the surface, but for what the surface suggested about what was behind it. The overhang was there. Rutherford had described it correctly. The top of the face extended forward of the base by nearly 2 feet, The upper limestone more resistant to dissolution than the lower, the base retreating, as the water had worked the softer carbonate away over centuries of freeze and thaw. She walked to the face. She crouched at the base, the same crouch she had used on October 3rd at the Voss claim, the crouch that had been accidental then and was deliberate now. She put her face close to the overhang and looked inward along the base of the rock. Darkness, not the shallow darkness of a recess 2 feet deep, the specific darkness of a space that extended beyond the reach of the morning light, the darkness of a cavity that went somewhere. She said without turning, "There is a cavity." She unwrapped the torch and lit it. She crouched and moved under the overhang and into the entrance. The others followed. The entrance was lower than the Voss cave, requiring them all to move more carefully through the first 10 feet before the passage opened into the chamber. The chamber was smaller than the Voss cave, 8 feet high at the center, 9 feet across the walls, the same gray Minnesota limestone. The ceiling lower and flatter, following a different bedding plane. Less dramatic, more functional. Eleanor held up the torch and held the thermometer at arm's length in the center of the chamber. They watched the mercury in the still cave air. It stopped at 53 degrees. 4 degrees warmer than the Voss cave had been in October when Eleanor first measured it. She had told Oscar she expected this based on the south-facing aspect of the Drover's Ridge face. She said nothing now. She let the number speak. She held the torch near the cave entrance passage and watched the flame. It bent inward. The warm cave air pulling outdoor air slowly into the chamber, the same convection current she had identified in October at her own cave, the same physical mechanism that made the system work. She said it breathes. Cornelius was standing at the far wall. He looked at the thermometer she was still holding, reading it for himself from where he stood. He did the arithmetic. She could see him doing the arithmetic of a man who had spent the past 5 days with the numbers in a notebook and who was now watching those numbers confirmed in a second cave on a second property at a second limestone face. He said 53. She said yes. 4 degrees warmer than the Voss cave this morning. The additional warmth comes from the south-facing aspect accumulating more direct sunlight through the summer. She said from this cave at 53 degrees to the Pelham cabin at 68 degrees is 15 degrees of stove work. She said at minus 37 outside without this cave, the stove would be working 105 degrees. Rutherford Pelham was standing at the center of the chamber. He was a large, quiet man who had spent 3.5 months of a hard winter making the specific calculations that men made when they were trying to manage an inadequate supply against an unmanageable cold. And he was now standing in a cave that was 53 degrees and that was 60 feet from his cabin wall. And the look on his face was not relief, which would have required that he first allow himself to feel the weight of what had been pressing on him, and he had not yet put that weight down. It was something more immediate and forward-facing than relief. It was the look of a man who had identified the next step and was already measuring the distance to it. He said, "Tell me where to cut." They began on Tuesday. Eleanor assigned the work the way her father had assigned the work at the charcoal operation, by function and capacity, each person doing what they were best suited to without ceremony. Rutherford and Cornelius cut the passage frame from birch poles in the Pelham East timber because they were the strongest. Oscar fitted the boards for the roof sections because he had the most precise hand with the saw. And Eleanor cut the opening in the Pelham cabin back wall and framed it and began laying out the passage floor, because Eleanor was the only one who had done this before, and the framing of the opening required the specific knowledge that came from having done it once and learned from what the once had taught. Edna Pelham worked alongside them. This had not been stated in Eleanor's plan, but it was Oscar understood always what Eleanor had expected would happen, because Eleanor had spoken to Edna in the cave with the tone of a woman instructing someone who would be doing the maintenance after the builders had gone. Edna packed snow insulation against the passage walls with the flat wooden paddle Eleanor had made for the purpose, working in the minus 37 morning with the focused attention of someone who understood that what was being built was the difference between this February and the previous one. Eleanor watched her work and offered only the corrections that were necessary for the thermal integrity of the construction. Pack denser at the joints. The gaps are where the cold enters. She said, treat every gap as a failure you are preventing, not a deficiency you are tolerating. Edna packed denser at the joints. By the end of the first day, they had the passage frame set and the first 4 sections of roof board fitted, and the opening cut in the Pelham cabin back wall framed and ready. Eleanor checked every joint before they stopped for the day, running her bare hand along the frame, members in the fading afternoon light, feeling for gaps. She found 2. She marked them with charcoal for the morning. She said, "Cold air finds every opening. You find them first." The work took 9 days. On the 7th day, during a mid-morning break, when Oscar and Rutherford had gone to the far end of the passage frame to address an alignment issue in the last section, Cornelius Thwaite was working alone on the south exterior of the passage, applying the clay and moss mixture to the joints where the passage wall met the limestone face of the Drover's Ridge outcrop. He was reaching into a narrow gap between the passage frame and the stone face when his hand found something that was not stone and not clay and not any part of the construction. A fold of paper, oilskin wrapped stiff with cold. He pulled it out carefully. He held it in his hands and looked at it and understood immediately and without ambiguity what it was and what it meant and how it had come to be where it was. It was a letter. The address on the outside in handwriting he recognized from 7 years of receiving correspondence at the Rum River Trading Post was Mrs. Eleanor Voss, Rum River Settlement, Minnesota Territory. The handwriting was August Voss's. Cornelius did not open it. He held it and breathed in the cold air of the passage and looked at the letter for a long moment and did the accounting that the letter required. It had come to the Trading Post in November. He remembered it now the way you remembered things that had been present and unattended, a piece of mail received during the weeks when the post road was becoming unreliable and the incoming volume had dropped, and the correspondence that arrived sat longer on the counter before being sorted. He had put it in the drawer where uncollected items waited. And then the November business of the Trading Post had accumulated around it, and the conversation about the Voss claim and the widow who had cut a hole in her cabin had become a regular feature of the Trading Post discourse, and the letter had remained in the drawer attended to by no one, while the woman it was addressed to spent the winter in a system she had built from September arithmetic and October construction, alone without knowing that a letter from her husband had been sitting in a drawer 60 feet from where she bought her salt and her lamp oil. He had been the one saying she was not thinking clearly. He had been the one saying she would be dead or gone by spring. And the letter from her husband had been in his drawer for 2 months. He pulled Oscar aside before they stopped work for the day. He spoke quietly. Oscar listened. He looked at the oilskin packet. Then he looked at Cornelius. Cornelius said, "I will give it to her myself." He said, "Today before we leave." Oscar said, "All right." Cornelius put the letter in his interior coat pocket next to his chest, where the warmth of his body would keep it from the cold through the afternoon. That evening, as the others were preparing to ride back, Cornelius asked Eleanor to walk with him to the far end of the passage frame to look at the alignment issue Rutherford and Oscar had addressed that morning. He wanted, he said, to understand the correction she had approved. She walked with him. He showed her the alignment issue. She explained the correction. And then, standing in the passage in the fading light, he reached into his coat. He held out the letter. He said, "This came to the Trading Post in November." He said it simply without qualification. He said, "I put it in the uncollected drawer when the post road closed, and I did not remember it until I found it here this morning." He looked at her steadily. He said, "I should have found a way to get it to you." 6 words. No additional framing, no explanation that softened the failure. Cornelius Thwaite was a man who understood that the weight of a wrong thing was not reduced by the number of words you used to describe it. You said the thing, and then you stood with the weight of it. Eleanor looked at the letter in his outstretched hand. She looked at the handwriting on the outside. She took the letter. She said, "Thank you, Cornelius." She said it simply, without edge and without performance. It was a genuine acknowledgement, nothing more and nothing less. She put the letter in her apron pocket. She looked at the passage joint they had been examining and made one additional observation about the tightness of the corner seal. Then she walked back to where the others were waiting and said nothing more about it until everyone had ridden away and she was alone. She waited until she was in the Voss cabin. The door closed the stove, doing its quiet work. The passage door pinned shut behind her. Then she took the letter from her apron pocket. She opened it. August had written it on the 12th of October, 1873. The handwriting was the careful block letters of a man who had learned to write as an adult and who had never stopped treating the act of writing as something that required his full attention. 2 pages, both sides of a single folded sheet. He wrote that he had reached St. Paul in the third week of September. He wrote that he had found the man to whom the debt was owed and that the negotiation had not gone as he had hoped, which meant the debt was larger than the paper in his coat had stated, because there was interest, and the interest had been accumulating since 1871 at a rate he had not understood when he signed the original agreement. He wrote that he was working at a timber yard on the south side of St. Paul, loading and grading lumber at a wage that was reasonable for the work, and that was going directly toward the principal of the debt. He wrote that he was living in the yard's bunkhouse and eating the yard's food and spending nothing on himself, and that at this rate, he expected to have the debt cleared before March. He wrote, "I will come home in March. The snow will still be on the road, but I will come home in March because I will not ask you to manage another month alone after February if I can prevent it. I know what February is on the claim. I know what I have asked you to manage, and I know you will manage it because you manage everything. But I am coming home in March." He wrote, "I am ashamed of the debt, and I am ashamed of the interest, and I am ashamed that I did not tell you the full amount. I told myself I was protecting you from a worry that I could solve myself. I understand now that this was not protection. This was a man deciding what his wife needed to know about her own life, which is a different thing entirely and a worse one." He wrote, "I think you know I am coming back. I think you know the debt is the only reason I have not come back already. I think you know these things because you know me better than I know myself, which is something I have always known and not always been grateful enough for. The last line before the signature, whatever you have decided to do with the winter, I trust it is right. I trust this without knowing what it is." Eleanor read the letter twice. She sat with it in the 68-degree cabin, with the cave breathing behind the back wall and the stove doing its quiet, reduced work. She was not crying. She had done that work in September and October in the mornings before the construction began, in the private hours before the work required her full attention, and all the weight of the winter pressed most clearly on the days ahead. She had allocated time to grief the way she allocated time to everything that needed to be done, giving it the mornings when the work had not yet started, sitting with it until it had been given what it required, and then proceeding to the work. By November, the work had been the winter. By December, the winter had been simply the winter. And now it was ending. She folded the letter carefully. She opened the notebook to the current day's page and pressed the letter flat between the pages the way you kept something that belonged in the record. She wrote the date at the top of the page, January 24th, 1874. She wrote Pelham Passage Construction Day 7 of 9. Cave temperature, Drover's Ridge 53 degrees. Outdoor temperature -29. Pelham cabin temperature improving. She wrote letter from August received dated October 12th. He is working at a timber yard in St. Paul to clear the debt. He will return in March. She wrote the next line and finish in the smaller handwriting she used for the things that were not data but that belonged in the record anyway. Tieden, Hentuli Tuckerson. I know. He is coming back. She closed the notebook. She went to the stove and put another piece of birch on the fire. On the 9th day of the Pelham construction, Eleanor fitted the cave entrance door. She had built it in the Voss cabin over 2 evenings, the same 2-layer bark construction, with the air gap between the layers, the same pole hinge, at the top of the entrance frame. She fitted it to the Drover's Ridge entrance in the morning and spent the better part of an hour adjusting the hang of it, the gap at the bottom where it rested against the stone floor, the seal at the sides where it met the entrance frame. She was working on the final adjustment when she heard Edna Pelham come into the passage behind her. Edna crouched beside her without speaking and watched the work with the attention of someone who intended to maintain what she was watching. Eleanor made the last adjustment and took the torch from its bracket and held it at the gap at the bottom of the door. The flame bent inward. Eleanor said, "It breathes." She said to Edna, "Come here. Put your hand at the gap." Edna crouched and held her bare hand at the space between the door's lower edge and the stone floor. She said, "I feel it. Warm air coming through." Eleanor said, "That is the cave breathing into the passage. That is the system working. Every morning 30 seconds with your bare hand at this gap. Air moving inward means the system is functioning. Any change from that pattern means something needs to be found in the passage and addressed." Edna held her hand at the gap for longer than 30 seconds. Eleanor waited without filling the silence. Edna said quietly, "It will still be warm at the end of February." Eleanor said, 45 degrees in the cave by April. Warmer than that through February and March. She said the stove takes it from cave temperature to 68. That is all it needs to do. Edna removed her hand from the gap. She sat back on her heels for a moment. Then she said, I should have asked what you were building in October. Eleanor said you had no reason to ask. The thing I was building was not obvious from the outside. Edna said I heard what Cornelius said at the trading post. She said I believed him because I had no reason not to. She paused. She said I should have gone to look for myself. Eleanor said you had your own winter to manage. Edna said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said Rutherford spent 2 hours a day at that woodpile, every morning for 6 weeks. She said it the way she said things that had cost her something to witness. She said I watched him come in and hold his hands around the coffee cup and not drink it for 10 minutes while his hands came back. Every morning, Eleanor said nothing. Edna said, when this is built and working. She paused. She said, could it help others, the other South Lake families? Eleanor said, I have mapped 3 outcrops on the South Lake Plain. She opened the notebook to the page where she had drawn the positions from Oscar's descriptions. She said, I cannot know without going to look whether they have cavities. But the conditions that produce cavities are present at all 3. She said, if you want to make it your work to find out which ones do, I will tell you exactly what to look for and how to assess what you find. Edna looked at the notebook page, at the 3 positions marked in Eleanor's careful hand, at the question marks Eleanor had drawn next to each one indicating probable rather than confirmed. She said, show me what I'm looking for. Eleanor showed her. She described the indicators with the same precision she brought to everything, the specific angle of undercut that suggested dissolution work, the direction of facing that indicated solar accumulation, the type of surface texture that distinguished a cavity entrance from a shallow recess. She described how to use the torch to read the depth of darkness. She described the 3-minute thermometer reading and what numbers meant what. Edna listened with the complete attention she had been bringing to everything Eleanor told her since Saturday. When Eleanor finished, Edna said, I will look in spring when the snow is off the faces. Eleanor said the spring outcrops are easiest to read. The frost cycle reveals the dissolution work more clearly when the face is clear. Edna said, and the construction? Could I teach someone else the construction? Eleanor looked at her. She said, yes. If you understand why each element works, you can teach it. She said the concept first. Then the construction follows from the concept. She said the difficult thing to convey is that the cave is not the destination. The cave is the preparation. It changes what the stove is asked to do, and that changes everything downstream. Edna said, I understand that. Eleanor said, I know you do. They came back out of the passage and into the cabin, which was 64 degrees and rising for the first time since October. Edna stood in the middle of her own cabin and looked at the thermometer on the wall and said nothing for a long time. Then she went to the stove and added wood with the careful economy of a woman who still had a habit from the weeks when each log had to be counted, and the habit would take time to unlearn. The Pelham system was declared complete that afternoon. Eleanor walked the full passage one final time, her bare hand against every joint, pressing every surface in the methodical progression she had developed for her own maintenance walks. She found one small gap at a joint near the cave entrance. She filled it with the clay mixture. She checked again. She said it is tight. She said to Edna, do the weekly walkthrough without fail. Every joint, every surface, bare hand not gloved. Gaps found small can be filled in minutes. Gaps found large after they have been large for weeks require reconstruction. She said the passage is the connection. Maintain the connection and the cave does the rest. Edna said, I will not miss a Sunday. Eleanor looked at her. She said, I know. March came the way March came in Minnesota, not as a season, but as an argument between seasons. The days above freezing interrupted by nights that remembered February, the snow on the south-facing slopes going granular and gray at the edges while the north-facing drifts held their January density. The air had changed its quality without yet having changed its temperature. There was something in the light in the late afternoon that the January light had not contained, a softness at the edge of the cold that the cold itself seemed not to have noticed yet. Eleanor had been alone on the Voss claim for 6 months. She did not feel alone in the way she had felt alone in October when the passage was still being built, and the only thing between her and the winter was arithmetic she had not yet been able to confirm. She had written in the notebook in February and finished, the cave is good company. It has been here longer than I have. It will be here after I am gone. It does not know about August or the debt or the winter or the spring. It knows about July. It is patient in the way that things are patient when they are too large to be in a hurry. She had gone into the cave in the evenings, sometimes in the weeks when the cold was at its worst, not for maintenance, but for the 45 degrees of stone that did not change, regardless of what the thermometer outside was doing. There was comfort in the thing that did not change. She had noted this in the notebook without explaining it further because the notebook was a record of what was true, and this was true. On the 12th of March, she was in the East Timber cutting the first of the spring birch poles for the fence repair she had been deferring since October, the same work she had been doing on October 3rd when she had crouched lower than usual and seen the darkness under the limestone face when she heard the horse on the north road. She did not stop cutting. She listened to the sound of the horse on the frozen road and identified from the pace and the weight of the hoofbeats that it was a single rider moving at the steady trot of someone who had been traveling for a long time and was not pushing the horse because the horse had been traveling for a long time as well, and both of them knew how far was left. She had heard this specific quality of hoofbeats before, the sound of a man and a horse arriving rather than passing, coming to a specific place rather than through it. She put down the hatchet. She walked out of the timber and across the open ground of the claim. August Voss was dismounting at the post by the cabin door. He had lost weight. 6 months of bunkhouse food and timber yard labor, and the specific weight that shame and distance put on a man, had taken something from him that was visible in the way his coat hung and in the way he moved. He turned when he heard her footsteps crossing the frozen ground. He looked at her. He looked. She looked at him. She said, "Come in." He tied the horse and followed her to the door. She opened it and went through first, and he followed and stopped in the doorway. The room was 68 degrees. He stood in the doorway with the March cold at his back and the 68-degree cabin in front of him and looked at the thermometer on the east wall and at the stove burning its moderate, unhurried fire and at the small door in the back wall pinned shut with the wooden peg. He stood there for a moment. He was a man who noticed the details of construction and spaces, a man who had built things with his hands and who read structures the way Oscar read chimney smoke, for what they told you about what had been done and how well it had been thought through. He said, "What is that door?" She went to the shelf and took down the notebook. She said, "Sit down." He sat. She set the notebook in front of him. She said, "Read the September pages first, then October, then the temperature log. Read it in order." She said, "It will take some time." He looked at the notebook. He looked at her. She said, "Read it." He read it. He read it the way Oscar and Cornelius had read it, slowly and without skipping, turning the pages with attention. He read the September arithmetic and the October thermal reasoning and the 3-month temperature log and the wood consumption figures and the projected versus actual comparison that ran down the final column. He read without speaking. He turned back to the September calculations once and read a specific section again. He read for 20 minutes. At the end of the last temperature log entry, he stopped. He looked at the line and finish at the bottom of the January 15th entry, the first day Oscar had come. He read it aloud in Finnish in the careful way of a man reading a language that was also his Kallio muistaa kesin. He said, "Your father's line." She said, "Yes." He turned more pages and found the January 24th entry. He read it. He found the Finnish line at the bottom of that page also. He read it silently this time. He sat with it. He said, "You knew I was coming back." She said, "I knew the debt. I knew you." He looked at the notebook in his hands. He said, "I should have told you the full amount." She said, "Yes." He said, "I told myself I was protecting you from a worry I could solve myself." She said, "I know." She said, "I found the paper in your coat in August. I have known about the debt since then." She paused. She said the not telling was the problem, not the debt. He said, "I know that now." She said, "Yes." She said, "Come. I want to show you something before the light goes." She stood and took the torch from the bracket and unhooked the passage door. She went through crouching. He followed without question, the way a man followed when the person ahead knew where they were going and why. He stood up in the cave chamber. He looked at the thermometer on the wall, 46 degrees. He looked at the walls, the smooth gray limestone, the arch of the ceiling, following the natural bedding plane of the rock. He was a carpenter and a builder. He read spaces differently than Oscar had read this one or Cornelius. He looked at the ceiling first, and then the walls, and then the floor, assessing the structure with the instincts of a man who had spent his working life understanding how things were held up and what they were held against. Then he looked at the thermometer again. 46 degrees. He looked at Eleanor holding the torch. He said the summer heat stored in the rock. She said yes. He said in the passage from here to the back wall of the cabin. She said 15 feet. I measured it the same day I found the cave. She said the distance made the connection possible. He said, and you built the passage. She said in 3 weeks in October. She said alone yes. He did not say anything for a long moment. He was looking at the cave walls and the ceiling and the space around him and doing the calculations that a builder did, understanding what had been required to cut through the cabin wall and frame the opening and sink the pole frame and roof it and seal it and connect it to this chamber in a way that preserved the thermal benefit of the rock's accumulated heat. He said 3 weeks. She said the framing was the fastest part. The cave entrance door was the slowest. She said the door has to be permeable enough to allow the convection current that connects the cave temperature to the cabin, but dense enough to prevent the wind from driving cold air into the cave faster than the rock can moderate it. She said it took 2 attempts to get the door construction right. He said what was the first attempt? She described it. He listened with the attention of a craftsman, understanding where another craftsman's approach had encountered its limit and what the correction had required. He said the 2-layer bark with the air gap. She said yes. The air gap provides insulation between the layers. The bark is permeable enough for the convection current without being open enough for wind penetration. He said quietly to himself more than to her, I would have put a heavier seal on it. He paused. He said that would have killed the system. She said yes. He was quiet. He looked at the thermometer reading 46 degrees. He said, how long will it hold? She said by April the outdoor temperature will be rising above 45 degrees consistently, and the cave will be cooler than the outside air. The system will have completed its first winter cycle. She said through May and June and July, the summer heat will conduct back into the rock, and by October the cave will be 51 degrees again, ready for the next winter. He said it cycles. She said every year. The rock absorbs the summer and releases it through the winter. She said the cave never goes below the mean annual temperature of the valley because the rock mass extends too deep for a single season's cold to penetrate to the core. She said 45 degrees is the floor. The winter cannot push it below 45, regardless of what the outdoor temperature does. He said 45 degrees as a guaranteed floor. She said yes. He stood in the cave for another moment. Then he said, I built the cabin in August of 1868, and I built it to the standard specifications for a 2-person homestead in this climate. He said it slowly with the tone of a man making an accounting. He said I built it to the standard I knew, which was the standard of what other people had built here. He paused. He said, you found something the standard did not account for. She said I found something that had always been here. She said I was looking for it because I needed it. She said I do not know how long it would have taken me to find it if I had not been looking. He said you were looking because I left. She said I was looking because the winter required a solution that the standard supply did not provide. She said that is what I was looking for. She said the cave was the form the solution took. She said I do not think I would have found it if I had not been crouching to cut birch poles on October 3rd. She paused. She said many things that matter are found while crouching for something else. He looked at her. He said, Eleanor. She said, come back through. I will make coffee. They crawled back through the passage to the cabin. She closed the passage door and pinned it. He stood in the 68-degree room and looked at the thermometer, and then at the stove, and then at the notebook on the table. She put water on the stove. He sat at the table and opened the notebook again and turned to the January 15th entry, Oscar's visit the first day the system had been witnessed by someone other than Eleanor herself. He read the entry. He read the note about the wood supply. He turned forward through the log, reading the entries for February, the construction of the Pelham Passage, the daily cave and cabin temperatures, the weekly maintenance notes with their specific observations about which joints had required filling and with what. He read the January 24th entry again. He read the finish line at the bottom. He said, you wrote this when you received my letter. She said, yes. He said, you were not surprised. She said, I was relieved. She said, there is a difference. She said not surprised means you expected something. Relieved means you had allowed for the possibility that you were wrong. He looked at her. She said, I knew you. I expected you were coming back. She said, I was relieved because knowing and expecting are not the same as certain. He said, I am sorry for the debt. She said, I know. He said, I am sorry for not telling you. She said, I know that too. She set the coffee on the table. She said, we will have time to be thorough about the apology. She said, at the moment, I would like to tell you about the Pelham Passage and the Drover's Ridge Cave and the 3 outcrops that Edna Pelham is going to survey in spring. He looked at her. She said, there are other families in this valley who need what I built. She said, Edna understands the concept now, and she understands the construction, and she is going to look at 3 south-facing limestone faces on the South Lake Plain when the snow is off in April. She said if any of them have cavities at the right temperature, she will teach the construction to those families herself. She said the method can travel without me. August sat across the table from his wife in the 68-degree room that she had maintained at 68 degrees through a Minnesota winter, with less than a third of the wood a standard calculation would have required. And he looked at her the way a man looked at something he had been insufficiently attentive to. He said, you built this alone? She said, I had the arithmetic and the cave and the October weather which cooperated. She said, I had 3 weeks before the hard cold arrived, and I used them. He said, you had been planning since August. She said, I had been thinking since August. She said, the planning was September. The building was October. She said, by November, it was simply the winter. He said, simply the winter. She said, yes. The system does what the system does. The maintenance keeps it doing what it does. The rock does the rest. She picked up the coffee cup. She looked at him across the table. She said, you said in the letter that whatever I decided to do with the winter, you trusted it was right. He said, yes. She said, was that true when you wrote it? Or was it something you wrote because you wanted it to be true? He thought about this for a moment. He said both. He said, I wrote it because I wanted it to be true, and because I believed it was true, and I did not know how to separate those two things at the time of writing. She said, and now he looked around the 68-degree room, at the thermometer, at the small door in the back wall, pinned shut, the cave behind it, still holding the summer heat of the previous year, declining now toward 45, the mean annual temperature that was the floor below, which the winter could not push it. He said, now I have read the notebook. She said, yes. He said, and the notebook is not a thing you write to be trusted. It is a thing you write because the record matters and the numbers are what they are. She said, yes. He said, I trust it because the numbers say to trust it. He paused. He said, that is more solid than wanting it to be true. She said, it is. The stove burned its comfortable fire. Outside, the March air held its argument between winter and spring, without resolution the way it would for another 3 or 4 weeks, before the spring won definitively, and the snow began its final retreat from the claim. In the cave behind the back wall, the limestone held 46 degrees and was declining toward 45 the floor, the temperature at which the rock's memory of summer was exhausted and the rock was ready to begin receiving the new summer. By May, the outdoor warmth would begin conducting into the limestone. By July, it would be climbing again. By October, when the first cold arrived and found the rock charged to 51 degrees, the system would begin its second winter, and its third, and however many winters this valley still had to offer. Eleanor picked up the notebook from the table. She opened it to the page after the last temperature entry and wrote the date March 12, 1874. She wrote August returned, debt cleared, he is well. She wrote the 3-column entry, cave 46, cabin 68, outdoor -11, wood remaining 2 cord and 3/4. She paused over the last figure, 2 cord and 3/4 remaining in March. At the start of a normal Minnesota winter, with a standard 2-person supply, she would have been calculating whether she had enough to reach April. She had enough to supply 2 winters more, if the winters were standard, which they were not, but the margin was real, and it was there, and she had calculated it in September, and it had held. She wrote the last line of the March 12th entry in Finnish. Kallio muistaa Kaizen. She looked at the line. Then she looked at August, who was sitting across the table from her in the room she had kept at 68 degrees through the worst winter in recent memory, with a wood supply that should have been exhausted in February. He was reading the notebook backward from where she had stopped going through the winter log in the direction of someone retracing a journey they had missed. She said April. He looked up. She said in April, the outdoor temperature will climb above the cave temperature for the first time since October. She said the cave will be cooler than the outside air. The rock will have given back everything it held from last summer. She said, and then it will start learning the new summer. He said 51 degrees by October. She said yes, every year. She said the mean annual temperature of this valley is 45 degrees. The floor. The rock never forgets the summer completely because it never cools all the way to the floor before the new summer arrives to refill it. She said we have not run out of summer yet. August looked at her. Then he looked at the passage door in the back wall and the small wooden peg that held it shut and the cave behind it that was 46 degrees and declining slowly and patiently toward its floor, the way limestone declined at the rate of something too large and too old to be hurried. He said, I will look at the passage construction tomorrow. He said it with the tone of a craftsman who has seen another craftsman's work and wants to understand it from the inside. He said, I want to understand the framing of the entrance opening and the pole setting method you used for the frame members. She said, I will show you. She said there are two things I would do differently a second time. She said the corner joints at the cave entrance could be tighter, and I did not get the outer bark layer even enough in the third section from the cabin end. She said neither failure has compromised the system, but they are things I would correct. He said you have been thinking about what you would do differently. She said I think about it on the Sunday maintenance walks. She said when you are looking at the construction every week you see what you would improve. He said what would you change about the entrance door? She described it. He listened and asked two questions, both of them specific, the questions of a carpenter, understanding a colleague's solution to a problem he has not previously encountered. She answered both. He sat with the answers. He said the two-layer bark with the trapped air gap. He said that is correct. He said I would have arrived at the same construction eventually, but I would have tried 2 or 3 heavier solutions first before understanding why they would kill the system. She said I tried one heavier solution first. She said I lost 3 days to it before I understood the problem. He said 3 days in October. She said 3 days that I had. She said the October window was narrow. She said I could not afford to be slow. He said, but you were not slow. She said I was fast enough. She closed the notebook. Outside, the March evening was coming down over the claim, the light going out of the sky in the specific way it went out in Minnesota in March. Not all at once, but in stages, the cold blue of the upper sky remaining after the horizon had gone dark, the stars appearing first in the east, while the west still held color. Eleanor went to the passage door. She unhooked the peg. She opened it a crack. The warmth of the cave came through the gap. 46 degrees of limestone that had spent 6 months holding the summer heat of the previous year, and that was now in the last weeks before the spring finishing the long, slow release of what it had held. The specific warmth of something that had been doing this job patiently and reliably and without the need for management or attention, except the 10 minutes of weekly maintenance that kept the passage tight and the connection sound. She stood with her hand on the warm door. Behind her, August was reading the notebook, going backward through the winter, arriving at October, arriving at the September calculations, arriving at the first pages where she had written out the arithmetic on the first week of September in the year that August went to St. Paul with a debt to settle, and Eleanor Voss sat alone in the cabin and began the work of understanding the winter that was coming. She listened to the cave breathe. It breathed slowly. At the rate of convection through 2 layers of birch bark with a 3-inch air gap, the rate she had determined by test in October, the rate that was permeable enough for the system to function and dense enough to prevent the wind from defeating what the rock provided. The winter had not had her. She had calculated it in September and confirmed it in October and built it in 3 weeks before the hard cold arrived, and it had run without interruption since November 1st, and it would run until April when the outdoor temperature rose above the cave temperature for the first time, and the system completed its first full cycle, and then the limestone would spend the spring and summer charging itself again with the heat of the new season, and by October it would be ready to give that heat back through the same 15 feet of passage and the same 2 planks hinged at the top and the same stove that did 18 degrees of work instead of 109 every year. The same cycle, the same rock, the same physics that her father had understood in the charcoal pile in the forests of Hum 40 years before she stood in a Minnesota cave with a thermometer reading 51 degrees and understood what she had found. She closed the passage door and pinned it. 68 degrees in the cabin, minus 11 outside. The difference between those numbers was 15 feet of passage and 400 tons of limestone that remembered July. She had the winter. The winter had never had her.